Hello and welcome to Design Systems Community Chapter Toronto. We're here for a new meetup starting here on Twitter Spaces. It's a new place, it's a new time, and I am your co-host, Enrico, and I'm disguised as the Toronto Twitter account, so you cannot see my name or my face, but trust me, it's me, Enrico. I'm also here with my co-hosts, Varun, Donna, and Lucy. They will be around, and I'm also here with special guests, Earl Cousins and Eric Bailey. To get started, there's some housekeeping. Today's topic is the state of accessibility in design systems. It is an open conversation where everybody here is welcome to join in the conversation. We'll open up with our guests, Eric and Earl. Afterwards, you're welcome to raise your hand, invite yourselves to speak, and bring up a topic related to the state of accessibility in design systems. Today's event is sponsored by Wrangle.io. We thank them for their continued support, allowing us to bring more design systems content to you. Some other housekeeping, our code of conduct is enforced in this space. Let's be kind to each other and let's learn and grow together. You may see more details about the code of conduct on our website at designsystems.community. Once our guests have each had a turn to speak, we'll open up the space for some audience participation, and you'll be able to ask our guests questions around this topic or bring up a related topic and share with everybody here. Be sure to request to speak from the Twitter app, and our hosts will let you in when appropriate. And with that said, let us introduce ourselves and our guests. Starting with myself, my name is Enrico Sacchetti. I am the co-host of Design Systems Community Chapter Toronto. I am here with Donna. Let me let Donna say a few words. Okay. All right. Donna, are you able to speak? It's all right. We'll come back to Donna while this catches up. Earl, please give yourself a brief introduction to the participants.
Sure. Hi, my name is Earl Cousins, and I'm a senior digital accessibility specialist at Scotiabank, and my pronouns are he, him.
Thank you. And on to Eric.
Hello, I'm Eric. I work for a company called Ad Hoc and help work on the healthcare and Medicare.gov design systems. My pronouns are also he, him, and it's nice to be here and nice to see a lot of familiar faces.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. And back to Donna.
Hi there, everybody. Sorry about that. Okay, I am Donna Vitan, and I am the design lead for the design systems at TELUS Digital. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm very excited to have everybody here. We got Earl, we got Eric, we got Enrico, we got the E's, and we got everybody here. Thank you for joining us, and everyone's been like RSVPing to the meetup. We're very excited that you're all hyped up about accessibility.
That's right. Spam that emoji button here on Twitter Spaces. Let us know you're around and let us get started. I believe we're going to open up with a topic brought by Earl, and we're just going to talk a bit about the state of accessibility in design systems with Earl and Eric's perspectives. And once they've had a chance to talk, please feel free to jump in, raise your hand, and we'll allow you to speak with ourselves as well. Let us begin.
Hey, thanks, Enrico. So I'd like to start off, I guess, by speaking a little bit about my favorite part of working with our design system and our design systems team at Scotiabank. And really, it's, for me, a couple of things. From an accessibility point of view, really looking at scalability. We have a small team, not as many accessibility experts as we have designers or developers, certainly. We have a small accessibility team. And so we want to have impact at scale. And so working with the design system team allows us to bring consistency and predictability to the design system components and to design and developers' work. Obviously, our bank is quite large. And so there's a lot of different project teams. And working with the design system means that we can influence and enable those teams to incorporate accessibility best practices and inclusive design in their products, even if that team is in another country, or they're working on a product that we don't even know about yet, or they don't even necessarily know that our team exists because they're in a very different section of the bank or the enterprise. So I'll start off there with scalability, consistency, and predictability are really the big winning aspects for me.
Yeah, I agree. I think for many things, design systems are, not the answer, but a pretty good answer. And in terms of like reducing the surface area of accessibility issues, design systems are very effective at doing that. And like, will anything ever be 100% perfect accessible? No, that's like a myth, but it does a really good job at reducing the number of potential issues just by virtue of using it if everything's going well. And I think that's incredibly, incredibly valuable.
Yeah, I'd agree. And there's also even that aspect of using the design system. I talked about project teams, but then there's also, I think, something that sometimes isn't necessarily top of mind as accessibility experts is also that user experience of the designers and developers, and how easy is it for them to implement accessibility or think about inclusivity. What is their workflow like, and how can we convey things in a way or put tools and processes in place for designers and developers through the system, right? Through the design system as kind of like that lever in order to help them get to intended outcomes, but in a way that respects their workflow and doesn't cause a whole bunch of friction, I guess, or extra work is how I might put that.
Yeah. Like, one thing that kills me, absolutely kills me, is like, a design and development team have a unique set of constraints, and they build a solution for just an exotic interaction pattern, and like maybe they don't consider accessibility and it goes out the door, or maybe they do and they put a lot of work in to like get it right. And if it isn't codified and then like migrated into the design system, like all that work is kind of, in my opinion, it's like lost because it's a one-off, and websites aren't static. And even banks, they do update, and then it's just kind of lost forever. And so like I think a design system is really good at is absorbing these kind of interesting issues and interaction patterns, and then making all that work invisible to the person consuming it. Because like I think there's different levels of maturity for organizations kind of working with accessibility, and like some people just don't care, and if you can do it for them, that's great, because then they don't have to think about it and you don't have to think about it, and it's nice and everyone gets along.
Yeah, I like what you said there about that if it doesn't get consumed or absorbed by the system, like it's almost like this dead end of work, right? And then no one ends up ever learning from that, I think, right? That there's another kind of piece there too, in that where like the design system is kind of where all the different people on all the different products, or in our case at the bank, there's folks in half a dozen, well, actually more than that, different countries. And so there's even different languages going on, and these really different contexts for a lot of work that here in Canada we wouldn't necessarily think about. And so it's that place where all those roads can cross, and all of those different points of view and context that different people have, and those different customer needs. Some good examples that I've seen have really come from what some of our folks are doing in Latin America. They're working with products that we aren't in Canada, and they have a context that we don't. And so that's always an opportunity to learn. And the design system being able to consume that learning, I think, is a huge opportunity for everybody across the board. Especially, I would lean on maybe more of a design point of view, right? But I think if you don't do that, if you end up with these kind of, folks kind of go down these dead ends and they solve things, but that doesn't get incorporated, like you have to have a way. You have to have a way for that to happen, I guess, that's easy or somewhat frictionless, right, in order to contribute and collaborate. Otherwise, yeah, like you just end up not knowing what you might have lost, right?
Yeah, totally. I'm thinking actually of an example of like, I think accessibility and localization are very close friends. And one thing we actually ran into, which was we had some CSS pseudo content as a kind of a pattern in one of our components. And then, here comes localization, and like it definitely kind of upped the complexity of that component, but like in a good way. Like it forced us to make good decisions about how we treat, different languages, and like, these little hacks just didn't kind of cut it. But like that's one of those like you don't know it until you do it kind of things. And fortunately we were able to react to it nicely, but like I wonder how many more of those little things are out there hiding, waiting, to be discovered.
Yeah, there's probably a ton of them, and there's a few here in Canada. I like to think we're kind of lucky in a way in that we have official bilingualism, and what that means is that we have to, out of the box, format all kinds of numbers and currency banking products in French currency formats, right? So that kind of stuff. That doesn't mean that going any further than that is necessarily intuitive for folks, but I think it's maybe a little bit more top of mind, that there isn't only one way to do things. And then my other favorite example, and there is a point to this, I know I'm rambling a little bit, but my other favorite example of this is date formats, where Canada's in the awesome position of having British history and being next door to the US. And both of those countries use different date formats. So of course we use both depending on who you are and what day it is, or whether the day begins with T or like whatever that is. And so, but this is the kind of thing I think the design systems, possibly can help with, is if those kinds of things are documented at the system level, then that can just kind of take a lot of that guesswork out of a bunch of those kinds of aspects of things, and take some of that confusion and friction away from teams, right?
Yeah, that's this is quite riveting as a fellow Canadian, and understanding the different needs and contexts of multilingualism and accessibility working together. This reminds me of my time I spent at working with Donna on a design system. When we onboard teams, one thing we would like to get across immediately is, can a design system, if consumed perfectly, make your application accessible? And it's a true or false question. And this is usually an eye-opener, because at a basic level, we want to onboard teams. We want to make sure that no, consuming the design system does not make your application accessible in itself. You have to follow some guidelines. And then that also starts conversations and helps us as design systems maintainers to bring those documentation to everybody. And with that context in mind, Earl and Eric, would you say that the current state of design systems has something going for it with this onboarding, and how's it compared to the past?
I mean, the value prop of a design system is hilarious, where it's basically like, we're not going to produce tangible work kind of. It's going to take a long time, and it's going to be hideously expensive, and maybe people will use it. But like that's no, I think it is far better than what's come before. I think it's like a codification and an industrialization of a lot of kind of things people have been doing independently in the past. And now there's just a better term for it and a way to kind of talk about it in a more industry way, as opposed to one little person somewhere in a corner having very strong opinions about how things should be. And like, you can have the most accessible components in the world, but like, the thing that I always kind of go back to is like, you can create a confusing user experience using accessible components. So like, it doesn't, air quotes, solve design. It just makes it a lot easier to facilitate better and more consistent designs. And like, that's huge from a cognitive accessibility standpoint. And I think we often overlooked that aspect when we talk about accessibility and kind of just jump to screen readers. But like, the majority is cognitive accessibility, and especially working on government systems, that's something we take really, really serious, because if you're on healthcare.gov, things may not be going well and you may not be in a great state. So it's important to keep things as clear and understandable as possible when navigating this incredibly complicated system full of jargon and bells and whistles and, local and federal legislature and all that good stuff.
Yeah, that's great. I want to kind of follow up on a couple of things you said there. And, there's the one is, design systems aren't like this magic wand that make your project accessible just because you use the design system, right? My favorite analogy for that is that I can take perfectly well-made Lego components and I can make an upside down pyramid with them that falls over, right? And that's kind of my go-to. That doesn't mean that those Lego pieces of Lego, there was nothing wrong with them, right? But if I do certain things, it just doesn't work, right? And so I think a lot of where, it's not necessarily a magic wand, but I think the other aspect, and, this is to kind of build on, I think you kind of alluded to that design systems are a little bit, or perhaps much better than in the past, where a lot of folks or a lot of companies would have, we would have a pattern library, or we would have like a, kind of like a, I can't even remember, like a style guide, right? But those things weren't necessarily like systemic, right? And so I think design systems are a little bit more robust in general. And then I think the other piece of that is having the guidelines, right? There's more than one way to do things, right? There's more than one way, perhaps, to make certain things accessible to certain degrees for certain types of interactions, right? And so I think those guidelines, or those kind of like the guardrails that the design system team can put in place, it's about helping designers make decisions about which interaction is appropriate here. How might these things work together? Or if I used a different combination of elements, how might that work better for what I'm trying to solve, and or for just more people and be more inclusive, right? I think that's a big piece there too.
Indeed. I want to remind everybody here on Twitter Spaces, if you're logged into the app and you would like to speak, please go ahead. You can use the request to speak option and you can join the conversation with us if you like. So just with that reminder out of the way, let's move ahead. Let's try something a little bit different. How about some faux pas and common misconceptions? For example, when working with teams and seeing the way they utilize the design system, or even the way they test their experiences and test their interactions, what do you find that are either really advanced and hard to see, or even basic faux pas that people make when testing or implementing accessible experiences?
Maybe I can kick us off. I've got lots of these, so and no offense to anybody on the call, but I guess I'm going to start with my favorite, and that's just because a UI pattern is common doesn't mean that either it's good or it can't be better or more accessible. There are lots of things that are out in the wild that are very common that are not that great for people. And what I'll do is I'll pick on actually one of my favorite companies, Google, and I'll pick on the Chrome visible focus indicator because it sucks and it's light blue. And so I'll pick on them. They should have solved that decades ago and they still haven't. So I'll pick on that first.
Indeed, just because something's popular doesn't mean it's great. And I think a personal one for me is like testing VoiceOver on Chrome and Firefox. If you're on a Mac, you should be testing VoiceOver on Safari. And I find personally, like I run into this issue where I would use VoiceOver on Chrome, and sometimes it would work, and I would fall into the trap of keep using it that way, which is incorrect. Donna, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say that on top of like Google, people like to reference other design systems that are like, oh, it exists here, it must be good. And I think it's not saying that it's not good. It's like, bring it here and then tell us what makes this accessible. It's kind of tell us why you think that's accessible and not just be like, I got it from a big company, it must work.
Yeah, I think I've been burned by that before for sure. And like, I don't think there's like negative intent here. I just think it's a very like niche thing. Like if you're into web accessibility, you've probably fell down a few rabbit holes if you're not directly affected by it. And like, it gets very arcane very fast. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And there's also, unfortunately, a lot of people that speak with confidence without testing or testing in the wrong way, as you alluded to, which isn't bad per se. It's just like there's a lot of arcane knowledge out there. And I think like one important thing here is representation, because I can use VoiceOver on Safari, but it's not my daily driver. So like I don't have that lived experience. And then there's nuance within that because like I'm comfortably on my Mac laptop that I'm on all day, every day. But like, are we testing it with Android's screen reader that is not TalkBack and has changed its name, but it's really TalkBack? Like, that's where my head's at recently, because I think like survivor bias, like if we are working for healthcare.gov and, like what is the experience like for somebody that has like a $30 Walmart track phone from 2 years ago that runs Android screen reader and they're only partially technologically literate? It doesn't work. That's a lot different than VoiceOver, which has like complicated heuristics and millions of dollars of development work put into it.
Hey, Eric, just for a personal question, what is survivor bias? I'm not familiar with the term.
Yeah, survivor bias is the logical fallacy that you only basically acknowledge the people that made it through a selection criterion. So like a good example of this is it's such a like inclusive designer cliche. I'm sorry. It's a good example of this is like you don't meet the minimum system requirements to load a piece of software. So the analytics only track people that can run that software, but that may not be indicative of all the people that want to use it. So you're overcorrecting for the people that made it through.
Understood. Thank you for that. Also, quick reminder to everybody here, if you would like to speak, go ahead and request to speak and we'll let you join the conversation. So on that note, yes, there are some common misconceptions. And when I think about the state of design systems, I've noticed that nowadays, when I see a new like white labeled or ready to use design system, Some of the time, I'm pleasantly surprised to see that they're accessibility first thinking. Sometimes I see a design system prop up say, hey, this is an accessible first design system that you can use for your websites and customize it a little bit. It has all the interactions you need. A personal favorite is React Aria, brought to you by Adobe Spectrum's team. I like how they make it easier for React-based websites to have proper interactions and have proper and accessible interactions. So seeing that come into the present day is pleasing. Have anyone here also seen some good upward trends, such as that?
I mean, I think just the fact that like accessibility is present, like I feel like I don't know what kicked off making it as like industry popular as it is now, but like the fact that it's showing up on the conference circuit, on like industry blogs, and like not just within the accessibility community itself is pretty cool. I never thought it would happen, so I'm glad it is. And I think there's a self-perpetuating effect here where the more you see design systems having it as a top level consideration, the more other people, parrot it and like take it as kind of table stakes of like what a mature design system is, which is just really cool.
Yeah, I think there's been a little bit more, what's the right word? Just more public awareness in general. I think folks are becoming more vocal. If you kind of look back, maybe a couple of years ago, there was things like, Beyonce being sued over her website or whatever that was, and so, those the people who were following her on Twitter or whatever that was, or who follow her career, they wouldn't have necessarily even thought about any of that ever, right? But there are these things that are happening, or even if we look at like a lot of what's going on in gaming space, where I guess it was like Last of Us Part 2 had 60 different accessibility features, and and Microsoft last year made a racing game that has ASL interpretation in the career mode, and nobody saw that one coming, right? And so I think there's these kinds of places where it's popping up, where there are these certain companies that they've really started to figure out, hey, we actually can do a bunch of things that we haven't done before, and we are going to make a commitment to that, and then it becomes visible in ways that I think the general public just never anticipated, and then it just we are starting to see, I think, some momentum there in different spaces in different ways that is really actually great.
Yeah, and I love it as aspirational. I think historically accessibility has kind of this negative connotation as like the fun police that come in, at the 11th hour to tell you about something you've never heard about, then this is bad and you should feel bad and you got to change it all, and also the deadline's tomorrow. And like seeing it, I think the games industry is actually like eating the web industry's lunch in terms of positive portrayal of accessibility, despite the gaming community having some pretty toxic views towards it. There's just cool stuff. Like if I could do it all over again, I'd probably get into games just for that. And like the really cool thing is like, when you really get into the spirit of accessibility past like, did you add an alt attribute, which is just a constant battle, is like you start to be able to do really interesting things with technology, which is kind of the goal, like the ability to customize, the ability to have a variety of experience, the ability to like meet somebody's access needs. Like that's really cool space to be in.
Yeah, and something you made me think of in there too is around, I think it was around testing and around just kind of workflows of like, so if we think of a design system team, right, and we think of maybe designers' tools, and we think about what's in the way of, we see all these examples. Well, I mean, we mentioned some, but there are examples of folks doing really excellent work, right? And I'd like, I like to think that the design system team I'm working with is doing excellent work as well, right? And so through that, we've worked with them to put some different tools in place, like accessibility Figma plugins and things like that, right? And so, but something that kind of comes up, and actually, we're reevaluating our tool set right now to, because new tools become available. And so we're looking at, what plugins do we have, for example, in Figma? Are there some more out there that maybe do those same things better? But really where I'm going is around that idea of getting back to that design and developer experience and workflow, and are we enabling them, or are we just kind of putting friction in their way? Like people kind of talk about that, right? And the way I kind of look at that is if accessibility is seen as adding friction or bloating out your workflow, I think that's coming from a space of, where when everyone's a new accessibility expert and they start talking to teams, and if a team hasn't experienced implementing accessibility before, they see it as extra work, right? And so where I'm kind of going here is, if it looks like the tools and processes to implement and test for accessibility, if that's being seen as friction, then that means your workflow never took that into account, right? Like that's actually part of your workflow. And so if you weren't doing those things, I mean, obviously we should make those things efficient as we can. But if a team wasn't doing those things, then really they're not doing the whole workflow, right? It's not about extra work anymore, right? We have, company policies and standards and all kinds of reasons why we should be meeting accessibility requirements, right? And so I think, that idea of friction, I think kind of needs to be turned inside out a little bit. And it's more like, if you're seeing this as friction or a barrier, it's almost a recognition of you should have been doing that all along. And so if you didn't have time for it, somebody needs to give you more time, really.
Hey, Earl, thanks for that. So, Ruben, thank you for patiently waiting. You may go along with Donna and then followed by Thomas. Go ahead, Ruben.
Yeah, so sort of branching off what you said, Thomas, and then also kind of circling right back to your statements, Eric, on how there is oftentimes this this perception from outside of design systems that this is the solution to a company's accessibility problems. And don't get me wrong, like I'm a huge proponent of design systems. I think they can solve 50 to 60% of really common issues. And I just kind of like wanted to share like some of the ways that I've been able to kind of like move this into a little bit more of an operational thinking. And so exactly what you were saying, Thomas, is yes, when there is this perception of like, well, you're adding to work that wasn't there before, I think yes, you get a lot of pushback there. And so kind of with that in mind, one thing that I've been kind of doing and have seen some success is actually having the design system partner with QA. And sort of like breaking things into categories, and saying if this feature or something has these categories, here are these checklists to make sure that the design system is behaving in an accessible manner, right? Because the unfortunate reality is it's pretty easy to wrap a design system component in such a way that an event handler can be lost, right? And then all of a sudden you've lost, keyboard navigation and screen reader navigation. And that's just been something that I feel like has been not really talked about enough, of kind of like the design system partnering with QA. Because I feel like oftentimes there's this idea of like, I've used the design system and therefore QA's work is actually, less.
rather than, equal to what it was for a custom component.
Thank you for offering your perspective, Ruben. We're actually going to touch upon QA and testing very soon, but I wanted to make sure Donna and then Thomas had a say first. Donna?
Yeah, no, thank you, Ruben, and thank you again for sharing that. I just wanted to top off on like what Eric was saying, and again what Earl, you've already all said, is that by making our design system components like have accessibility like foundationally, it allows us to do more of like maybe open up new delightful accessibility experiences and really tap into what's happening in the game industry, right? Like I think there's still lots of ways to go that way, but like as we level up everybody who's using the design systems, as design systems and accessibility like improve, add in content documentation and content practices, that kind of stuff, I just feel like we'll have more room to add them.
Thank you, Donna. Go ahead, Thomas.
Sure, I'll add on to what Donna was saying. I've had a ton of experience working with a lot of different companies on their design systems, and as someone that has maybe like a experience looking across a lot of different companies that develop the design systems, sometimes I feel like there is, you can call it ego and or you can call it logically, if you work for a company, you want to build something yourself because, hey, you're spending tons of hours a week there and you don't really want to use, right, like HTML standards. I guess, one of the attitudes that I come in with is, okay, so if it's related to ego and or you want to be creative, the minimum bar is like you have to work the equivalent of how HTML natively works. And that's something that I guess is very frustrating for me working with so many different companies where you basically see these design standards that create and recreate the same design patterns over and over that, I think combo box or select element is a common one for me where it's like, oh, I needed to have a rounded corner on that. And then by designing it that way, now it's not accessible. So I guess definitely echoing what Donna said, that I'm probably more in the design system. What would be cool and exciting is you're doing something more, or you're like innovating, delighting, you're doing something more than that. But even at what a lot of companies I think don't meet is you already recreated something that already exists in the standard set of controls, and you don't even do what currently exists. So that's just my perspective there.
Yes, indeed. I think there's an evolution of attitude happening. I don't have a label or word for it, but my experiences a few years ago where some folks would be upset if the so-called creative process was hampered by implementing accessible solutions. But I'm hoping that that's less of an attitude or less of a vocal attitude nowadays, since if you're building something that is meant to make the internet better, meant to make information easier to reach people better, then it's not so much about creativity for the sake of creativity. It's about making things accessible because that's what information is all about. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I mean, like designer ego is a hell of a drug. Like anytime that happens, it's just like a long, protracted sigh because it's going to be a very uphill battle. To Thomas's earlier point too, like I think HTML, the standard, needs better primitives. Like we're starting to say this kind of sort of maybe with like modal finally kind of potentially being good to use. And then like the open UI is kind of sort of getting there, but that's like realistically a decade out. But like it's not a document-based web anymore, and our primitives don't reflect that, and they need to be updated, in my opinion. And we also know a lot more about how AT works and like how that integrates with like how people actually use stuff. And I think it's this weird inflection point on the web where we're kind of trying to make do with what we have, but also like welcome to web development. Here's, here's a form element that you can use, or an input element, and it has native validation. Oops, don't use that. It's terrible. Haha, sorry. Like, it's very complicated.
Indeed. Go ahead, Ruben.
Yeah, just to continue to branch off of that. Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely, sympathetic to some of these designers, especially in regards to certain components. For example, the HTML spec doesn't have a native tab component. In order to make that accessible, you have to build that custom. Dialog was just recently supported, the beginning of this year by Safari. Um, having having a modal that you can't escape out of with a screen reader, because oftentimes folks just check if a modal is escapable, through keyboard navigation, is still, incredibly difficult. And yeah, I really want to reiterate your point, Eric, that yeah, we need a lot more primitives. There is a lot of very common UI patterns that that we still have to build custom. And this is like one of the things that kind of like really frustrates me, because I am absolutely an HTML purist, and I will tell people use HTML, but oftentimes the reality is sometimes that doesn't exist, or it's incredibly hard to style, and those are those are really hard conversations, because I just wish better primitives existed.
Indeed. Go ahead, Earl.
Yeah, those are all really great points, and I think this is a lot of what you're speaking to is really showing the potential value of design systems in general, and that if there is a way to solve for some of these design problems, the use of a system means that an organization only needs to solve for these ones, right? And whether that's native HTML or ARIA rules or whatever those things are, that's there's different tools at our disposal. But I also take the point that there's and we see this too, where we've got something in the system, and for some reason or another, someone wants to make an alternate version of that, right? And so I think it really, those are difficult conversations, and that's where Eric has his big sigh. But and I think it's a real challenge where it's more, I think, about why do you want to do something different, and what value is that going to bring to let's say this is something customer facing. What values is that going to bring to the customer, right? And so then maybe what they've actually figured out is maybe there's a gap in the system version of that component, and that's okay, right? That's going to happen. But at the same time, we can't have 3 versions of everything, right? Just because people have differences of opinion, right? In some way or shape or form, people have to come to some kind of consensus, I think, right? And that's what really ends up being in the system, right? And I think maybe it's a little bit unrealistic to think that everyone's going to buy into that, right? And unrealistic to think that people aren't going to run with their own exceptions at times. But yeah, I think there's some good conversation that can come out of that, and that maybe there's opportunities to figure out why that person thinks they need to do something different is really the key there, right?
For sure. I like how this is sort of evolving to the state of primitives, because it directly correlates to the work we do. Eric, you go ahead next, and then Kathleen, feel free to raise your hand and you can go afterwards.
I'll defer to Kathleen if you don't mind. I think she was first.
Hi. So I'm still learning this this UI for raising my hand, but thanks, Eric. It's nice to see and hear all of y'all in this space. I wanted to bring up, because I'm loving this conversation. I'm loving the focus on accessibility and design systems. There are a couple of things that are also challenges. Is making sure that, I mean, you can make design accessible components, but you could also, if you don't have patterns in your design system, it's very important to have patterns to show how you can correctly implement these components in an accessible way, because you can combine something, in your layout, and it will result in an inaccessible solution. So that's something that we should keep in mind. So it's super important to, when you create accessible components, make accessible patterns in your documentation to guide everyone of what they can do, with these components. And also, what I think it was it Ruben or Thomas that was speaking about, there's different ways of, using a component, or everyone wants to do things a certain way. If you can, when you're getting more contributors to your system, if you can find a way to encourage people to have, like, contribute experimental components, to expose it to all other teams, especially if you're in a bigger company, you'll have a bigger chance of, one, landing on a common solution, and two, finding a way to get that accessibility in there and make everyone happy.
Yeah. Yeah, to your comment about patterns, like I have a Miro flowchart for how to label an icon or not label an icon for a tooltip toggle. I know tooltips are bad, but they're inevitable. And like, it is just a rat's warren of conditionals. So yeah, like having that kind of guidance, I think, is really important, because it's not just like, here you go, you can drop this in. It's like, what is the context that this is being used in? What choices have been made? And like, parts of that flowchart literally, point back to, like, you need to rewrite this because this tack you're taking just doesn't work. The other thing that, like, I think Earl kind of was getting at is, like, a design system is also, it's a political animal. Like, we like to think of it as a neutral canonical reference, but like, it is shaped by politics. And the representation of accessibility within it is also shaped by politics. And like, that's something I've been kind of grappling with recently. And to make it more immediate, like, we're updating our date component because there's a desire to make it fancy looking, and that directly conflicts with certain accessibility stuff. And so, like, we're trying to balance the two because we can't say no.
Thank you, Eric. Just a further reminder, there's under 10 minutes left of open discussion. Feel free to raise your hand to join the conversation. Also, thanks again, Kathleen, for bringing up patterns. It's always great to show people how to do things as easy as possible. Ruben, go ahead.
Yeah, just to further reinforce Catherine and Eric's point, is that, a design system is an internal product, and it needs to be treated as such, right? And that includes documentation, that includes marketing, that includes, letting folks know when changes are upcoming, and how to, migrate those changes. It's it's a really complicated beast, right? There's so many different parts to it, and if it's, I think really, if we just present it as, like, a series of components, and some copy guidelines and some colors and stuff like that, which I know, most folks are beyond that, but I think we really do it a disservice, and not only ourselves a disservice, but also, the people who are ultimately using our design system, the project managers, the engineers, the designers, the QA. And yeah, that's one thing that I feel like has been really helpful for me, and also for, like, when I'm talking to other people, of like, oh, well, why do you have so much documentation, right? Why do you spend so much documentation of, like, these are some of the accessibility constraints for our components, and these are some of the places, that we want to improve with accessibility for V2, in this component. why is there so much documentation for this design system? And I think, that's ultimately what how I steer it is like, this is a product. We are developing a product internally.
Yep, thanks again for that note, Ruben. For sure, it's almost relates to your thoughts earlier about QA and testing. Since accessible experiences is pretty much 100% a human thing, it's very difficult to completely automate that. There are some things we can do to get as close as we can to technical approvals with machine QA, but sometimes we need, or we definitely need, usability testing and human testing. Bruno, you've joined the speakers. Would you like to add a note? If you're not ready, that's okay. You can unmute your mic and raise your hand if you'd like to speak, Bruno.
Oh, sorry. It's my first time here. I was speaking. So adding to what Ruben said about treating the design system as an internal product, what I haven't seen, at least in projects that I'm working, is that accessibility is always treated in the stabilization phase at the end of the process of producing a component or introducing a new design layout. And what I see a demand for accessibility is to have also principles and thinking about accessibility at the very beginning, not only in the end of the stage of implementation. But I think that's a maturity that the product manager or the product team in general need to observe, and probably that's the level of the industry we are at this point.
Yep, for sure. Thanks for adding your note. Anybody else who wishes to participate, feel free to raise your hand or join the speakers. There's only a few minutes left. Oh, there's a baby.
Yeah, new baby has joined the chat. Yeah, so we do have a few minutes left, and we just want to give some time to take a breath and get back to their workday or what have you. So Earl, Eric, I think we kind of Enrico, if it's okay, if we can ask some kind of highlights, some tips, concerns that you want people to take away.
Sure, yeah. I would say I'm going to kind of go with another one of my. I guess it's an assumption that people make, and one of them is around. There's variation in human experience and intersectionality in human experience, and so an example of this is often when folks are new to accessibility. There's an assumption that all screen reader users have no vision. And that's not true. Most of them have some, and they have different types of vision. Someone might be using a screen reader because English or French isn't their first language, or they have cognitive concerns and they want to just read along with the voice. And then looking at intersectionality too. Often even accessibility experts, we tend to kind of bucket people at times just like everybody else does, where maybe we talk about deaf users, or we talk about blind users, or we talk about cognitive, or we talk about dexterity, and we don't necessarily talk about holistic intersectionality. And so I think that's a thing that maybe we need to spend a little bit more time on going forward.
Yeah. Like, I think the map is not the territory, to Earl's very good point of, how something is designed to be used and how it's actually used are two very different things. And so, like, to me, that kicks it over to representation, which I think is very vital, especially if you work on a big old honkin' project that a lot of people use, or a very small project that very specific people use, I guess. The other thing is, like, if you're into accessibility, you're into small wins over a long period of time. And, like, I do think design systems are a force multiplier for that kind of work. And, like, in terms of directed effort, that's where my head is at these days, because, like, one small tweak can have such a dramatic impact across a distributed system.
For sure. And when it comes to tooling, has there been lately an evolution in tooling? For example, I've used to use years ago and still today, there's a Wave plugin for browsers, there's Axe, there's Google's Lighthouse, which, as I mentioned earlier, automation testing is merely a baseline. You still got to have humans in there to really prove that something's accessible. But does anyone notice that any future or vastly improved automation tool is worth shouting out?
Not an automation tool, but you can quote me on this. I think the majority of access issues are actually created in the design layer. And I'm really excited to see annotation kits coming out that are a little bit more mature. And I think I'd especially like to see more maturity in the design applications that we use. And I'm going to put Anna on blast here because she's listening in, and I know she's been doing a lot of work in this space. And so I want to make sure credit is where credit's due.
One thing I really want to highlight, because it just kind of blew me away, is the last release of Mac OS and iOS for voiceover. They're now using machine learning to help recognize buttons that are being styled as divs. I think obviously this is a band-aid solution, but oftentimes I do think of like AI within the accessibility space as a little bit of selling more than it can actually do. But I really just, I've seeing AI used in this way to kind of like, really help some of the places where, the culture hasn't caught up yet. I think that's super great. And I just really, if there is anybody from the, accessibility teams over at Apple who worked on this, just amazing job. It blew me away when I first saw it in action.
That's high praise, Ruben. Anna, please speak.
Can you all hear me all right?
Can do.
I wasn't sure. I think Earl actually had their hand up before me. So I want to make sure actually that I respect that. Earl, did you want to go ahead first?
No, go ahead. I've talked lots.
Okay. Well, I saw y'all were talking and I had to join. I saw some recognizable faces, and yeah, I do want to like double back on what Eric said in terms of design and accessibility, because we have design systems and we need to account for clear pattern recommendations like Kathleen mentioned. And then, annotation kits are where we're starting to see those pattern gaps being accounted for. So going beyond what we have available, right, in terms of semantic HTML and what's baked into the system in terms of patterns, and making sure we account for what alt text is being used. How are we thinking about things like our heading structure? How are we thinking about things? I have a better example of annotations, but there's a lot of work I think that can be done in those systems to make them less like spec work and way more automated. So I totally agree. There's a lot of power in design and accessibility, but I think a lot of work to make it better for and easier for us as a community to do well.
All right, Earl, please close us off and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. I want to give a shout out to a Figma plugin, because I don't think a lot of people know about it per se. And one of the, I think, challenges that a lot of designers have is around focus order and figuring out what the focus order should be of various elements within their design. And so there's actually a Microsoft, I'm pretty sure it's Microsoft Figma plugin called Focus Order. It used to be called Focus Orderer. But they truncated the name to make it, I guess, sound better. It actually lets you figure it out and even test the tabbing in your design and number your tab order. It's pretty awesome.
I am scrambling to take note of this and tweet it out later. Thank you, Earl. And it's time to wrap up. So that was an hour of the state of accessibility and design systems. Please give our Twitter account a follow, DSCC_TOR. We are Design Systems Community Chapter Toronto. Check out our website, designsystems.community. And a special thank you to my co-host Donna, our guests Earl, and Eric, and our surprise speakers, Thomas, Kathleen, Ruben, and Bruno, and Anna. Thank you all so much for joining us today. That was riveting, and we hope to do this again in the near future. And the recording will be made available on our website. So lots of stuff to share out right after this. Thank you, and have a nice emoji wave day.
Thank you.